The Philippines is a country located at Southeast Asia. With over 7,641 islands, it has the seventh highest number of islands in the world. The history of Philippines can be traced back to nearly 709,000 years ago. Following the discovery of Pleistocene stone tools and butchered animal remains associated with hominin activity. But the earliest human remains of Philippines was the fossil discovered in the Callao Caves, which is famously known as the Homo luzonensis. It was considered as one of the oldest Homo sapiens remains in the Asia-Pacific. A genetic study in 2021, which examined representatives of 115 indigenous communities, found evidence of at least 5 independent waves of early human migration in Philippines. The first wave came around 46,000 years ago, mostly consisted of Negrito groups. They settled down on the island of Luzon and Mindanao. Another migration group known as the Austronesians, either from southern China or Taiwan, came to Philippines between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. The agriculture, and the languages of these Austronesian migrants quickly replaced those existing populations. Next up we have the Pre-Colonial Period, which covers the period of the year 900 to 1565. It begins with the creation of the Laguna copperplate inscription in the year 900. This inscription is the earliest known calendar-dated document found within the Philippine Islands. The Laguna copperplate records its date of creation in the year 822 of the Hindu Saka calendar, corresponding to 900 AD in the Gregorian system. The period also saw the establishment of the 3 social classes of the ancient Philippines society, which are the Maginoo, Timoa, and Alipan. The Maginoo, which means the noble class, was inclusive of several different types of people, including chiefs, warriors and slave owners. The Timoa, which is the middle class, was mainly the class of citizens who had bought their own freedom. And lastly Alipan, the lower class, was made up of slaves and debtors who worked to secure their freedom but held no rights. They could not own property or marry. City and states were also formed in Philippines during this time. Early settlements such as barangays ranged from 20 to 100 families on the coast, and around 150 to 200 people in more interior areas. Polities was founded in the Philippines around 10th to 16th centuries. Among the nobility were leaders called datus. They were responsible for ruling autonomous groups called barangay, or dulahan. When these barangays banded together, they would form a much larger settlement. In this case, these rulers would be recognized as paramount datu, raja, or sultan. The earliest European expedition to the Philippines was led by a Portuguese explorer named Ferdinand Magellan. The King of Spain at the time, Charles I, appointed Magellan as admiral of the Spanish fleet. Magellan was given the goal to reach the Spice Islands, which in present day is Indonesia. He set sail at the date 20 September, 1519, passing through the southern tip of South America into the Pacific Ocean. He discovered the Philippines for the first time at the date 16 March, 1521. He got into some native conflict, and was eventually killed in a battle. But the rest of his fleet managed to reach the Spice Island, and sailed all the way back to Spain. In 1543, Ruy López de Villalobos arrived at the islands of Leyte and Samar. He named them Las Islas Filipinas in honor of Philip II of Spain, at the time Prince of Asturias. Years later in 1565, a Spanish expedition led by Miguel López de Legazpi arrived at the island of Cebu. He was given the order by King Philip II of Spain to conquer and colonize the island. This marks the beginning of Spanish colonization at the Philippines. Under Spanish rule, Catholic missionaries converted most of the inhabitants to Christianity. From 1565 to 1821, the Philippines was governed as part of the Mexico-based Viceroyalty of New Spain, later administered from Madrid following the Mexican War of Independence. During this time, Spanish traders set up the Manila Galleon, a trade route between Manila of Philippines and Acapulco of Mexico. The galleon trade was mainly supplied by Chinese merchants from Fujian. These Chinese merchants would travel to Manila to sell the Spaniards spices, porcelain, silk cloth and other valuable commodities. Through the galleon trade, these items would be sold to Latin America's areas such as New Spain, Peru and Panama. Some were even sold to the European markets. Goods were shipped back from Acapulco to Manila as well, largely consisted of America's goods such as silver, sweet potato, watermelon and vine. The Manila Galleon lasted from 1565 to 1815, a total of 250 years. It ended because the route had become less efficient as many ships were captured by the Royal Navy from Britain. The development of the Philippines under Spanish rule has also created wealth for the locals. The new economy gave rise to a new middle class in the Philippines. With more educational opportunities, they managed to learn about the ideals of liberty from the French and American revolutions, which resulted in the rise of Filipino nationalism. The first revolt broke off at the year 1872, which is known as the Cavite Mutiny. It resulted in the deportation of prominent Filipino nationalists to the Marianas and Europe. The Cavite Mutiny would go on to influence the activities of the next generation of Filipino nationalists such as José Rizal. Speaking of José Rizal, he is considered one of the greatest heroes of the Philippines. He is most well known for organizing the Filipino propaganda movement, which advocated political reforms for the colony under Spain. During his time as a nationalist, he demanded reforms from the Spanish government such as having the equal rights before the law, replace Spanish friars with Filipino priests, and the freedom of assembly and speech. Unfortunately, these reforms were not favored by the colonial authorities in the Philippines. In 1892, he formed a civic movement called La Liga Filipina. The League advocated these moderate social reforms through legal means, but was quickly disbanded by the governor. Shortly after, Rizal was exiled to Dapitan, where he will live for 4 years. However, Rizal inspired many other Filipino nationalists. Most importantly, it led to the founding of the Katipunan. Katipunan was founded by the radical members of the La Liga Filipina, which included the famous Andres Bonifacio. In 1896, members of Katipunan gathered in Caloocan and declared the start of the Philippine Revolution. The event is now known as the Cry of Balintawak. Bonifacio called for a general offensive on Manila but was eventually defeated. Despite suffering from defeat, the revolution quickly spread throughout the provinces. By August 30, the revolt had spread to 8 provinces. These 8 provinces would later be represented in the 8 rays of the sun in the Filipino flag. Emilio Aguinaldo and the Katipuneros of Cavite were the most successful of the rebels as they managed to control most of their province by September to October. But many educated class did not initially favor an armed revolution. José Rizal himself, whom the rebels took inspiration from and had consulted beforehand, disapproved of a premature revolution. Due to his association with the members of the Katipunan, Rizal was arrested and executed for treason on December 30, 1896. On October 1896, Aguinaldo declared the existence of an insurgent government regardless of Bonifacio's Katipunan. Bonifacio lost his position as an election afterwards as Emilio Aguinaldo was elected as the new leader of the revolution. The next year, Aguinaldo established the Tejeros Revolutionary Government. But Bonifacio refused to recognize it and concluded the Naic military agreement. This eventually led to his execution in May 1897. By December 1897, the revolution had resulted to a stalemate between the colonial government and rebels. Pedro Paterno mediated between the two sides for the signing of the Pact of Biak na Bato. The conditions of the armistice included the self-exile of Aguinaldo and his officers in exchange for 800,000 Mexican pesos to be paid by the colonial government. Aguinaldo then sailed to Hong Kong to self-exile. The year 1898 saw the beginning of the Spanish-American War. During the war, U.S. forces defeated the Spanish naval forces in the Philippines. Later in December, the signing of Treaty of Paris officially ended Spanish rule in the Philippines. Spain agreed to sell Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Despite some resistance from the locals, U.S. forces were able to put down the Filipino rebels and established the insular government at the year 1901. During the American rule, numerous independence bills were submitted to the U.S. Congress, which passed the Hare-Hawes Cutting Bill on December 30, 1932. Although the law promised Philippine independence after 10 years, it would reserve several military and naval bases for the United States. The Philippine Senate eventually rejected the bill. Manuel L. Quezon, who later served as the second president of the Philippines, led the 12th Independence Mission to Washington to secure a better Independence Act. The result was the Titans-Mcduffie Act of 1934. It provided for the drafting and guidelines of a constitution, for a 10-year transitional period, as the Commonwealth of the Philippines before the granting of Philippine independence. America granted independence to the Philippines on July 4, 1946 during the presidency of Manuel Roxas. Both sides signed the Treaty of Manila, which provided for the recognition of the independence of the Republic of the Philippines and the relinquishment of American sovereignty over the Philippine Islands. From 1946 to 1961, the Independence Day of Philippines was still observed on July 4. But the efforts of President Macapagal saw the change date of Independence Day from July 4 to June 12. While July 4 was renamed as the Philippine Republic Day, June 12 was the anniversary of Emilio Aguinaldo's Declaration of Independence from Spain in 1898. Philippines, along with Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand founded the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, also known as ASEAN at the year 1967. After the presidency of Macapagal, Ferdinand Marcos became the next president of the Philippines when he won the election in 1965. Being one of the most controversial leaders of the 20th century, Marcos' rule was infamous for its corruption and brutality. He ruled as a dictator under the martial law from 1972 until 1981, and kept most of his martial law powers until he was deposed in 1986. In the 1986 election, the Commission on Elections declared Marcos as the winner after a controversial result. The fraudulent result was then rejected by many local and international observers, which led to a peaceful civilian-military uprising, now popularly called the People Power Revolution. It forced Marcos into exile and installed Corazon Aquino as president on February 25, 1986. Till this day, the Philippines continue to grow as an emerging market and a newly industrialized country, which has an economy transitioning from being based on agriculture to being based more on services and manufacturing. Fun fact: in 2019, Philippines won the position of world's top internet user with a whopping 10 hours and 2 minutes of average screen time. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe for more history content like this. This is my first history video. Your support would mean a lot to me and encourage me to keep on going. That would be all. I will see you in the next video.